Saludos. It's your host, Gabe Morales. I told you guys I was going to take a little break and do some projects that have been on the back burner for a while. This is one video that I thought about doing before I did the Mexican Mafia series. Maybe I should have, because sometimes I'm using terminology where I just assume the audience knows what I'm talking about. If you did time in the Pinta, then you already know. But for some of our non-law enforcement and even some of our law enforcement listeners, let me break down some of the terms that Mexican-American Chicano gangs, both the MA and West Familia, often use. You see, back in the day, the vast majority of officers, or guards, as they're often called, were white. They didn't speak Spanish, so a lot of the Mexican prisoners would speak Ancalo, which is a slang that I will cover in the next episode. This was the language invented by Pachucos. Basically, it was Spanglish as well as inventing new words. That was a language that was popular among many young Mexican Americans, especially gang members, going way back to the Zoot Suit days. But as time went along and CDC hired more Hispanic officers, Mexican and Latino inmates could no longer just speak in Spanish with the general comfort that the officers didn't know what they were discussing. So, starting in the 1960s, in particular, pushed by MA icon Cheyenne Cadena, who was very intelligent and would often go to the library and check out books on revolution and other cultures, including his own, and would study Nahua or Aztec. As time went along, he shared these books with some of his carnales, some of his brothers that wanted to learn also. There also was a cultural movement during the 1960s for Mexican Americans to learn more about their heritage. And so a lot of them learned about the Aztecs and Mayas. I did the same thing. In fact, the cover of my book, The Life and Times of Vato Loco, has a mural that I painted back in 1974 in Seattle, Washington, when me and my fellow Latino students were also part of the Chicano Pride movement in groups like MECHA, Movimiento Estudiantil Chicano de Aztlán. I'll talk about the word Aztlán more here in just a minute, but that was the Chicano student movement of Aztlán. As time went along, Mexican Mafia and West Familia gang members incorporated a lot of this Mayan and Aztec art into their tattoos and drawings, as you will see throughout this episode. If they're locked down in the SHU, a lot of times they were not allowed to go to the library. So what they would do is have somebody who was not in lockdown copy down these words, and then they would study them. Since they were on 23-hour lockdown, they had plenty of idle time to learn Nahua or Aztec. In the fall of 2000, some of the officers I worked with at New Folsom, who were still there after I left in 1993, captured an Aztec dictionary that had been handwritten. It said, In Otin, Iwana, In Tonali, Nikan, Tizonkia, Ilhui. Again, please excuse my poor Nahua, but that means here ends the roads and days. And they thought that was kind of cool to learn this code, like I said, and communicate amongst each other because they knew that authorities were monitoring their communications. They would use other words in Nahua, such as Itztoli, which is a shank or a knife, Miki, as in dead or to die, if somebody was to be killed, Itzome, which means pig, but would refer to the corrections officers or prison guards. Beto Godino had a tattoo on his abdomen, as you see here, Tekparo, which means a big knife or big shank, Tuca, which was a rat or snitch. Then they would write Huilas in this Nahua that they learned. Here is an Aztec Nahua code that I confiscated personally in the Violence Control Unit of New Folsom in the early 1990s. Now, here's the thing. Like I said, I also got into Mayan and Aztec art and culture. But then once I had a guest instructor come into the Proyecto Saber program, which was a dropout prevention program that I was enrolled in high school. And she told me that, you know what? Everybody says they're Aztec or Maya. Not me. I'm Yaqui. We didn't build big buildings and leave all kinds of signs where we were. Spanish could never totally conquer us. And that made me think, maybe I'm not Aztec or Mayan. And sure enough, I asked my dad and he goes, what? We're Yaqui. He went to San Carlos, which is in Sonora, one time, and he was so jazzed. He told me, hey, everybody looked just like me. Short, dark, native features. And sure enough, my great-grandmother, Juanita Tamayo, was on the San Carlos Yaqui Indian Reservation roll call. Anyways, true story. Here's me and my pops. Rest in peace. So as you see, if your people are from central southern Mexico, around the current Distrito Federal or DF, Mexico City, then maybe you are Aztecas. Or if you're from the Yucatan Peninsula or down in Chiapas, maybe you could be Maya. But the vast majority, over 80% of the country, was neither of those tribes. In fact, you are more likely to have been a slave or to have been oppressed by the Aztecs and Maya than to be Aztec or Maya. Now, granted, the Aztecas had great civilizations. The legend of Tenochtitlan is very popular amongst many Mexicanos and Chicanos today. Basically, legend has it that the Aztecs came from somewhere in the southwest United States, or Aztlan, and then traveled all over as a nomad tribe. And legend says they were to travel until they saw an eagle, the serpent in its mouth. And allegedly, one day that did occur. And that's where they built their capital city, on an island in the middle of a lake, as seen here on this old map. The Mayans predated the Aztecas and also had great civilizations. So no disrespect if you are, in fact, Maya or Azteca. I'm just saying, think about it for a minute. Have you done a DNA test? Have you asked your grandparents and great-grandparents where they're from? Because I'm telling you right now, if they're from Baja and lived there for hundreds of years, they're probably not Aztecas. Like I said, both the Inmate and Nuestra Familia will incorporate this Aztec and Mayan art into their tattoos and artwork. And while I'm focusing on California prison gangs in this episode, the same thing occurs in other states with Mexicaneme, Barrio Azteca, etc. They also use this language in their huilas, sometimes hidden in legal materials. For instance, this was a mensaje or message out from the Nuestra Familia, which is also called the O. If you see there, it says Tecutle, which is a noble one, or a carnal in the Nuestra Familia. They're talking about how they did strike at Way, which was a coded name, and why they hit him. And Conroy is another individual who was in fact killed, and it stated that he wasn't fulfilling his responsibilities, and that nobody has discussed that issue, even though a lot of people were at that time. They also talk about another individual named Tona, who is going to work in security for the benefit of the O, and everybody's supposed to follow and honor the instructions. Conroy was Miquel Castillo, and this word came down from Huete Rubalcaba, which is an issue that still is a matter of contention today amongst Nuestra Familia, as well as the Brown Bob Viramontes hit on whether that was a bad call. Here we see Albert Beto Gudino, and you see he has the tattoo Ticapatzin, which means big knife. And here's some of his artwork with a black hand hidden in it. Here's some more of his artwork with black hands, eternal war shield, and 3 dots and 2 bars. The Mayan numerical symbol for 13, which I'll get into more detail here in just a minute. Let me talk a little bit too about Huatic, which basically means that the person or object or place is that of great stature. And I've heard people on some other channels talk about, what is this guy talking about, a pili? What is a pili? I never heard that before. Well, in the prison gang world, a pili is a noble person, a nobleman or noble woman, but I've always heard it being addressed as a male, shakara or canal, but I guess it could be a senora also. I just never heard that. There's also the word campo. Campo means southern man or man from the south. I've heard that quite a bit and seen a lot of tattoos with that on it. In fact, I took this picture in Seattle, Washington, which is that of an MA associate that was up there. But like I said, a lot of people said there was no MA up in Washington State. This Campo records on the right, you see, actually comes from El Salvador. As many of you know, down in Central America, the Sureño movement was very strong for many years, although that may be changing due to disrespect by the MA towards Central American Mara Salvatrucha members in particular, but also some 18th Street. And so the opposite of Campo would be Ixpo, which means northern man or man from the north. Here are some tattoos of a inmate from the San Jose area with Ixpo, and he's using the 14 Mayan numeral system. The Ixpo records comes out of Washington State. Once again, there's also a lot of people who say there's no Nuestra Familia in Washington State either. I beg to differ, although the prison gang thing is not as big as it is in Calipas. I showed this on one of my videos addressing an individual from San Diego who was writing to another carnal saying Maclacti Omeji, which means 13 in Nahuatl. On the contrary, Maclactli in Nahuatl equals number 14, indicating that they are norteño or northerner, not necessarily Nuestra Familia. I also talked about in previous video about several individuals who use Aztec code names. Quetzalcoatl was a code name used by Martin Cato Vargas from Fresno. And by the way, somebody had mentioned that Cato had escaped from a BOP facility and has been in the wind ever since, which makes sense why when I looked up his BOP number, it just said not in custody. Like I said, they may incorporate these Aztec symbols into their tattoos. So the G war shield could be for gangster or grajeda. The M inside the war shield could be for a mate carnal, but just don't go off of one thing. You got to look more into it. Here's a war shield on Sal Colavella Diaz out of San Diego. I talked about old Rube Soto having his Aztec code name on his back. I also believe I mentioned Gato Martinez, who's good friends with Rube, as being a good artist, and he also would often hide symbols such as the mano negra in his artwork. So sometimes I hear people talk about the dots and bars as being Aztec. They are not. These are Mayan. This is the Mayan numeric system. The Aztec numeric system is different. So 1 is Se, 3 is Ye, but you don't just put 1 and 3 together and see Ye to make a 13. No, 13 is 2 bars and 3 dots. 1 bar means 5. 1 dot means 1. So here we see a guy who's got it right. 2 bars and 3 dots equal the Mayan 13. He claims to be a Sureño. But what do we have here? Here's a peseta or a dos cinco, and they're using 1 bar and 2 dots. So is that 25 or is that 7? Sometimes these guys will get even slicker and write in even a different language that's even less known. Here we see a Toltec message written to Bat Marquez, con todo mi respeto. A lot of times they don't know enough Nahua to make a complete message, so they'll mix it up with Spanglish and Nahua, as seen here. Shai wasn't the only one in the early days to use Nahua. Here we see Robot Salas and Patty Dominguez, who was his girlfriend at the time and also connected to law enforcement. And he gave her an Aztec code name of Quilatzli, which means a female divine force. In fact, a lot of words that people think are Spanish are actually Nahua. Did you know that tomatoes actually came from the New World? So the Italian red sauce wasn't even invented until after the 1500s. And of course, the Europeans went crazy with tobacco, which is also a native product of the Americas. Avocados, chili peppers, squash, pumpkins, all came from the New World. And what would Thanksgiving be without pumpkin pie? And in our family, we often have tamales for Thanksgiving and Christmas. And then, of course, there's a term that's more calo called pura masa, which unfortunately I've had to boot some people off of this channel for talking pura masa. And if you're so inclined, there are websites you could look up online that'll teach you much more about the Nahuatl language, Aztec and Mayan culture. But like I said, don't just assume that's your culture. You might want to find out. I hope you enjoy your families, and I wish you and your families a very happy Thanksgiving. For now, this is Gabe Morales signing off for Gangsters, Cops, and Politicians.